Hello and welcome to Scale Your Sales podcast. Now, with so many methodologies and sales processes, have you ever thought, what is the value of value selling? Now, with me today is Bob Apollo. Bob is founder and the driving force behind Inflexion-Point Strategy Partners, the B2B value selling experts. Now, following a successful career that spans startups, scale-ups, and corporates, Bob now works with ambitious, growth-orientated organizations to create scalable sales environments. So welcome to Scale Your Sales, Bob.
Janice, it's very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's been a real honor because I've been following you for a while. And as you know, I don't always agree with you, which is brilliant. And I thought that's why it's really great to get you on this podcast. I read your blog, which I thought was brilliant. Tell me something I do not already know, which is a great title to your blog. So I read a lot of your blogs, and I highly advise people listening here to follow you. They just need to go to Inflexion-Point resources and blogs and stuff. There's so much great content on there. So I really want to ask you more about what you do for your clients.
Well, as of the organizations I work with are in a growth phase. They're post-startup, but haven't yet sort of accumulated, the sort of all the trappings of being a corporate. And they're very often in some sort of intensive recruitment of new salespeople. So the challenge for organizations in that sort of situation is, firstly, how do we get the most out of our current salespeople by emulating the winning habits and behaviors of the best current salespeople? And how do we recruit new salespeople and induct them quickly in what we've collectively learned are the keys to success in our own business environment? So I really help them put together a simple but effective sales effectiveness program.
Fantastic. So perhaps give me an example of a company that you've worked with.
Yeah, so I'm currently working with a mid-size organization with a global footprint that had the classic challenge that maybe the vast majority of their revenues was coming from a relatively small percentage of their existing salespeople. So when you really looked under the covers at what distinguished those salespeople, certainly there was some of the explanations down to innate talent, but a lot of it was around, those salespeople simply worked in a more effective way to target and qualify and advance their sales opportunities. They had too much respect for their own time to waste it pursuing opportunities that were likely to go nowhere. And what we were able to do is to capture the accumulated learning of these best salespeople and embody it in a process that every member of the sales organization could follow. And that's brought some dramatic impact in terms of narrowing the performance gap between the average salesperson and the best. So that wouldn't be untypical.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've worked with some companies and they've had a sales guru or they've adapted a methodology, but it's got nothing to do with the culture of the organization. So I think it's really interesting what you say, that actually you looked at what already existed that was great and modeled that within the culture, within the organization. And I totally agree with you. That's when it really works. There's no point helicoptering something in that really isn't going to blend and align to, the customers, the structure, the culture of the organization. So I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's not to say that we don't at the same time incorporate proven best practice from across the industry. But the really important thing is you need to blend that with what's been proven to work in the current environment. And I think it has a major impact on the acceptance of any new process. If, to use your phrase, something gets helicoptered in from outside without reference to what is currently happening, or the culture of the organization, is far less likely to succeed than if a new program is seen to reflect what maybe some of the the salespeople that other salespeople most respect are currently doing.
Yeah, excellent. Now, I was watching your video, and it talked about the dynamic between the cost of inaction, which is quite prevalent in a consensus complex sale. Perhaps you can explain more about that for people that haven't yet watched your video.
Yeah, so I talk about the value gap. And to me, the value gap is the difference between what would happen if an organization carried on its current path and what it could achieve if it decided to pursue its opportunities. And one of the key considerations there is, so what would be the cost and consequences to our organization if we did not change? Now, what I've observed is many salespeople put inordinate stress on the benefits of buying their solution. And that message is always much more powerful when it's countered by a recognition on the part of the customer that actually, if they carry on doing what they're doing today, their business may be at risk. So that value gap is something that I've observed top salespeople do in a really effective way. They're able to contrast the customer's current situation with where they want to get to in the future, and persuading them that there are significant problems, challenges with just staying as they are is absolutely critical to creating an atmosphere that promotes the need for change.
But there's something also in the fact that the consensus sale, there used to be 5.4 people involved, and now some people say it's as much as 8 people involved in the decision-making process of what to do next. And because of that, the dynamics is that it's so difficult to manage that it's easier to stay where they are, easier to not make a decision.
If their current situation is insufficiently uncomfortable and you're in a consensus decision mode, then one very likely outcome is that group may conclude that they can stumble on, struggle on, carry on in their current situation for at least perhaps a little while longer. Actually, I think the latest figures from the Challenger Group, who founded the original research, has put the number of actively involved decision makers above 10 now. I mean, whatever the precise number is, it's a growing group. And there's a challenge to get consensus amongst that growing group of stakeholders. So one of the things we need to look for as salespeople is to find somebody who's really an internal champion, and not a champion for our solution necessarily, but a champion for the project. Somebody who can persuade their colleagues that this project needs to happen and that it is of a high relative priority to the inevitably large number of other initiatives the company could choose to take. So these are all key factors. Gartner's recently written about the need to create decision confidence. And, decision confidence is a combination of an acknowledgement that the organization needs to change and the confidence that whatever solution they choose is actually going to deliver the desired results. And of course, one of the reasons why there's a challenge there is so many companies have been very disappointed by the outcomes of projects that were, enthusiastically sold to them by salespeople. And they've become cautious.
So it seems that it's not just about the sale anymore. There's so much more that's involved in building the relationship, understanding the real value transfer, and working with them as partners over a long period of time. It's not get in, get out. It's actually kind of creating a real partnership, do you think?
Well, Absolutely, and that's one reason I always strongly recommend to the clients I work with that they think of this as a buying process and not as a sales process. Because if you think of the progress of any opportunity in terms of the customer's buying and decision-making process, you start to realize that that journey starts long before a salesperson might recognize a qualified opportunity. But just as important, that buying journey continues long after the customer's placed an order. And in fact, it only really comes to maybe a temporary conclusion when the customer realizes that they have achieved the value that they set out to when they embarked on this mission. So the buying journey just spans a much wider period of time than the sales process. And by the way, this is particularly important to anybody who's selling something on a subscription basis, software as a service, for example, because unless you deliver the value you had promised, your chances of getting a renewal are dramatically reduced.
In actual fact, I think you commented on a blog that I wrote about that, in that, I think that there's a real organizational transformation when a supplier changes its go-to-market strategy, like moving more of its business over to SaaS. And because of that, my view is, and the experience I've got working with companies, is that when it's just kept within the sales department or function, the transformation doesn't work as well, because in order to maintain the relationship with the customer, it takes all of the company on a regular basis, on a daily basis, to ensure that that buyer, that customer is happy. So it's not just in the sales department that manages the customer relationship when it's regular contact. So the whole organization needs to be involved in that, and sales doesn't always have control over the finance department or the marketing department or the production department also. So it was quite interesting, your response, in that it's the sales department that manages that, and I was saying, well, no, actually the CEO has to lead on this transformation. Perhaps we should share a bit more about that.
Well, I'd sort of make the distinction between leadership and management. So I think when it comes to any initiative that prioritizes the customer, the leadership certainly needs to come from the chief executive, but somebody's got to implement those programs. And I think it partly depends on the dynamic between CEO and their C-level direct reports. I'll give you an example. I've seen highly effective relationships where the CEO is a visionary, a strategist, but they don't have the mindset necessarily to follow through on the precise detail. They certainly want to see the metrics and the outcomes and so on. But the combination of a visionary CEO and a highly operational, set of C-level executives can work very well. And there, really, it is the C-level execs, and not necessarily the CEO themselves, that drive the detail of it. I think it depends. You use the word company culture on, the company culture, the nature of the leadership team, and so on. And it's not just a matter of assigning responsibility. I'll use the example of customer success, which has become, a really common department in any software as a service or renewable revenue business. I mean, it's quite dramatic how the growth of that function has developed over the years. But I still see some very broad range of implementations of the customer success idea. At one end of the scale, it's implemented at what is fundamentally an operational level, with the concern that the day-to-day usage of the solution is effective and successful. But the problem with an exclusively operational focus on customer success is you can often miss the strategic nuances. Very often the people you liaise with on that day-to-day operational customer success are not the people that set off on the project to start with, or who are concerned about the strategic priorities for the organization. So, customer success can't be managed by an individual. There needs to be operational aspects of it, strategic relationship aspects. And that to me is one very good example of almost regardless of where customer success reports, and I've seen it report in sales and in other places, it's really got to behave in a joined up way.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is the relationship of salespeople with the B2B buyer behaviors changing and evolving? Do you think that buyers need salespeople for their input, and what would be the situation where it's absolutely essential and the situation where it is negotiable?
Well, I mean, some years ago, I remember listening to Neil Rackham, who was the author of Spin Selling, talking about the polarization of both buying behaviors and sales competencies. And he pointed out something I think we can see going around us all the time. If the buyer believes that what they're doing is a simple and straightforward transaction, increasingly they prefer to do that without the intervention of a salesperson. If it's a repeat purchase or a purchase they're extremely confident in, they're likely to prefer to make it as simple as possible. Now, in complex sales, where the decision perhaps isn't a common one, perhaps it's a completely unfamiliar decision to the buying organization, I still see a very high degree of willingness to engage with salespeople on the following condition. If they believe that that engagement with the salesperson is not going to simply expose them to a tedious, poorly developed sales pitch, but if they think the engagement with the salesperson is going to result in some genuinely useful learning, then they're prepared to do it. And I think that puts a very interesting burden on, or expectation on, salespeople. And that is that really in every customer conversation, in those complex, considered purchases, you want the potential customer to emerge believing they've learned something, believing they're smarter at the end of the meeting than they were before, and certainly that they haven't been exposed to a sort of mechanical, thoughtless, customer or product-centric sales, company or product-centric sales pitch. So it's polarizing.
Yeah.
But I don't think the role of the salesperson is going away. In fact, I think in many ways, in those considered purchases, in those unfamiliar purchases, the expectation on salespeople is even higher.
So we've talked a bit about culture. And so what's your view on diversity in sales? Is it an issue? And if so, how should it be solved?
Well, I think it is an issue in some organizations. I was talking to a potential client the other day, and it sounded like every member of their sales force was cloned. There were white males in their 50s, had been selling for years. And, candidly, the challenge of creating an environment for change in those sort of cultures is very challenging, because, by and large, many of the salespeople might say, well, I've been successful over the years and I see no need to change. So I think that's ultimately a very unhealthy environment. So I tend to think of diversity not in gender terms or in race terms or religious terms or what have you. I tend to think of it in terms of diversity of thinking and the willingness to be open to new ideas. So that to me is absolutely critical in a sales organization. Bear in mind, I'm thinking about complex sales of the sort we've been talking about for the last few minutes. So you really need to recruit people more for their aptitude and attitude than for their past experience, for the very simple reason that you can acquire experience, but you can't change, by and large, by much, attitude and aptitude.
Isn't there something to be said that the the buyers, business owners, the workforce is changing. There's more millennials that are entering. There's almost 50% of the global workforce decision makers will be millennials. But then there's another aspect to the globalization. You know, organizations now can easily develop a customer base at the other side of the world, which is fantastic. But then that means the people that they're selling to, the buyers, the business owners, the managers within organizations, C-suite, they look different and they are different. So having a sales force, and this kind of sales force that you mentioned, where, you know, they all look the same, they've been in business, you know, been selling for 20 years, and I come across many of them that are resistant to using social selling and social media, which I absolutely love working with that group. But the thing with diversity of thought is that if you don't focus on the diversity of people, then it's really difficult to measure diversity of thought. And you can then ignore diversity, because you can say that, you know, the typical men, because there are more men in sales, they may come from different social economic backgrounds, so there's diversity of thought, but actually they're still not appealing to the women. They don't communicate in the same way. You know, men tend to like bullet points, women like stories, and it doesn't matter whether you're in C-suite. That's how a lot of, you know, people that are different people will communicate different, will see things differently. They're still not able to respond to those things. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I've certainly seen this in regional sales organizations around the world, it's very helpful if your sales team profile reflects the profile of the organizations you're selling into. And it's matching that. I'm not completely, by the way, necessarily in tune with this stories versus bullet points. I mean, certainly I've, you know, most of the effective men salespeople that I observe are much better storytellers than readers of bullet points. I mean, I kind of take your point. I mean, I think, you know, sales organizations would do well to reflect the profile of the buying groups in the organizations they're selling to. Yeah, and you know, it's like most of these things. It's no substitute either for making sure that you're hiring people with the right aptitude and attitude as well. You know, you can't pursue, you know, one line of recruitment without taking into account the tremendous importance of attitude and aptitude. And by the way, some positive range of attitudes and aptitudes are pretty useful in a sales organization.
Yeah. We've kind of come to the end of our time, so I'm just going to ask you, who is your hero or shero?
Well, I probably have a number of you know, business heroes, but you know, at a time where I think our politics around the world are in such a state of conflict, I have a long-standing hero in Bobby Kennedy, the presidential candidate who was assassinated just over 50 years ago. And I have to wonder what America and the other Western countries might be like if he had risen to office, because he was a person that absolutely believed in bridging the gaps between young and old, between religious, between races, and always sought the best in people. And I think, unfortunately, in today's climate, we're sorely missing politicians and business leaders who share that belief.
Wow. Very thought-provoking. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, Bob. Now, I know that you've got the guide to value selling, and I'm going to put that in the show notes. So thank you very much for that. So thank you for being a guest on Scale Your Sales podcast.
Well, I appreciate the invite and thanks very much.